So the Christmas season is almost over, and for another year at least, the shops and radio stations are putting all the awful Christmas music away. By no means am I a Scrooge when it comes to Christmas, and there's many a beautiful Christmas carol that it's heartwarming to hear at this time of year. But one song I'll definitely be glad to see the back of, other than that terrible John Lennon one, will be Do They Know It's Christmas by St. Geldof, St. Bono, and a pantheon of other 1980s celebrities, all brought together under the banner of Band Aid. For those that don't know, Band Aid was a charity single put together in 1984 by Bob Geldof and Midge Ure. The idea being to get as many famous people together as possible, to all sing on one track, then use the money raised from the sale of that single to help relieve a famine that had hit Ethiopia. Famously, Geldof said that he got the inspiration to put Band Aid together after watching a BBC News report filmed in Ethiopia at an apparent camp set up for the victims of a drought-induced famine.
As the sun breaks through the piercing chill of night on the plain outside Coram, it lights up a biblical famine, now in the 20th century. This place, say workers here, is the closest thing to hell on earth. People scrabble in the dirt as they go for each individual grain of wheat. For some, it may be the only food they've had for a fortnight or more.
Following shortly after the single's success, a mega concert was organised, Live Aid, which took place in both London and Philadelphia simultaneously, featured even more famous performers in the single recording, and was again set up with the aim of raising money for the Ethiopian famine. More than 150,000 people attended the two concerts, and as many as 2 billion people worldwide watched it on television. Since then, the song has been re-recorded multiple times by various Flavour of the Month pop stars, and other concerts have been put on, always with the more or less nebulous goal of helping the sick and the starving in Africa. In total, Live Aid and Band Aid combined have raised almost $200 million and have potentially influenced governments to donate countless billions more. Few, if any, Christmas songs have transcended the season and had the cultural impact that the Band Aid single has. Indeed, Band Aid, Live Aid, and the mid-80s Ethiopian famine have all collectively entered into the mythos of our society, in much the same way the Second World War has. A massive event whose influence echoes through our politics and social discourse and symbolises the core values our alienated and increasingly fractious society upholds. This was the moment being a celebrity went from meaning someone who was a popular performer to someone whose fame transfigured them, deity-like, into a person whose utterances, however uninformed, were treated like pearls of wisdom that everyone from the powerful to the poor sought. This is the moment Africa became synonymous with images of starving children, perpetually in need of more money from charity and aid programs, and the moment when uncritically transferring wealth to the third world became a moral good in and of itself for Western people. But what is the legacy of Band Aid? Was it really the moment of great moral sanctification people thought it was? And how is Ethiopia faring today? Let's answer that latter question first. At the time of Band Aid, the population of Ethiopia was approximately 40 million. By 2016, Ethiopia's population had more than doubled to over 100 million. Although a recent modernization of farming methods has increased food production, more than 80% of Ethiopians are still subsistence farmers cultivating crops prone to failure in drought. As many as 30 million Ethiopians live in extreme poverty, almost as much as the entire population of the country at the time of Band Aid, and malnutrition remains a serious and costly problem. The country's exploding population, coupled with climate change, soil erosion and other environmental factors, has meant the spectre of famine has not gone away for Ethiopia, but instead looms larger than ever before. What's more, the country has become dependent on food aid in a way that is being compared to a patient who becomes addicted to painkillers. The dependence on food aid also weakens the country's food security, how reliably it can feed its own people, exacerbating its vulnerability in times of drought or famine. Unsurprisingly, by 2016-2017, the threat of catastrophic famine in Ethiopia had returned to the headlines, after severe drought hit the Horn of Africa, causing crops to fail and animal herds to die out. In Ethiopia alone, as many as 10 million people were affected by famine in 2016, and more than 7 million in 2017 needed food aid. As Ethiopia's population grows, these issues just become larger and larger, yet the country's population growth shows no sign of stopping. Roughly 2 million more people are added to its total every year, whilst Ethiopian women currently have an average of 4.3 children, admittedly a fall from the high of 7.4 children at the time of Band Aid, but still more than enough for the country to continue growing throughout this century. The aid the West gives to Ethiopia and other African countries contributes not only to its lack of economic self-sufficiency, but stunts any attempts to overcome that lack of self-sufficiency, and fuels the population growth that makes the challenges of infrastructure, education, food and so on that much more difficult to surmount. But drought and famine are not a new phenomena for Ethiopia. Numerous famines have been recorded in the country since at least the 1500s, many of them devastating, many of them horrifying to those who observe them. The harsh environment and the subsistence nature of the lifestyle led by the overwhelming majority of people in Ethiopia has meant the country has inevitably seesawed between periods of stability and periods of scarcity. So what was different about the famine in 1984? Well, for perhaps the first time, the growth of mass media meant the entire world could bear witness to the carnage. Wealthy Westerners, whose lives were orders of magnitude more comfortable than those of the Ethiopians they saw in the media, felt both outrage and impotence before the suffering. So, many of them determined to assuage those feelings of discomfort and vicarious guilt, and set about addressing the problem in the simplest way they saw. People are hungry, so buy them food. This is where the likes of Band-Aid step into the picture, offering people a way to raise money and feel a sense of participation in the act of saving Ethiopia.
You've got to get on the phone and take the money out of your pocket. Don't go to the pub tonight, please. Stay in and give us the money. There are people dying now.
However, beyond the inability to foresee long-term complexities, like those already outlined, Geldof and the other Band-Aid organisers failed to address the complexities of the situation as it existed at the time, sometimes willfully ignoring these complexities, instead presenting a simplistic vision of human suffering that could be sold to a public ready to buy into ostentatious acts of virtue signalling. The famine in Ethiopia during the mid-80s was not entirely the result of environmental catastrophe, but was perhaps largely the product of actions taken by the communist regime who ruled Ethiopia at the time and the civil war they were waging against various rebel groups. Failed economic policies coupled with deliberate napalming of farms in rebel areas worsened the conditions that the drought had created. A refusal by the regime to allow food aid into rebel-held areas turned starvation into a weapon of total war, and the forced resettlement of people by the government led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The massive amounts of money brought into the country as a result of Band-Aid and other funding drives may in fact have provided a pretext for the regime to speed up its program of resettlement, with many people tempted into aid camps on the promise of food, then facing forced relocation at the hands of waiting government forces. Though not specifically related to Band-Aid, substantial evidence exists also that food and monetary aid were diverted by government and insurgent forces for use in the purchase of arms and other military hardware. Declassified CIA documents and a controversial report by the BBC allude to this. Geldof, Band-Aid and the numerous other aid organisations operating in the country at the time were by no means ignorant to these complexities, but chose neither to communicate them to the public nor to cease their operations in the country. Only Médecins Sans Frontières at the time pulled their aid workers out of the country, citing a refusal to collaborate in a terrible situation they saw unfolding. When confronted, Geldof has typically scolded critics for the indignity and immorality of daring to question his competence or his objectives, using the very fact that he intended to do good as though it were a shield to deflect criticism. As grim as it may seem, there may be no real humanitarian answer to persistent famine in areas such as Ethiopia. The more the West intervenes with aid, the more the population grows. The more people there are struggling to feed themselves in an area that has limited capacity to sustain them. With each famine, the situation becomes more precarious for more people, and with each intervention of Western aid, more people are born who will amplify the problems of starvation and suffering. All of this also facilitates mass migration from the Third World into the West, bringing new problems into the countries and lives of the very people who donated their money in the hope of making the world better. The legacy of Band-Aid is hard to understate. Third World aid became a fashionable cause. Rock stars became political figures. Donating to Africa became synonymous with doing good. Suddenly, consumerism became moral. The public could participate in redemptive acts of good merely by watching television, attending a concert, or purchasing a record by their favourite artists. In an age that is spiritually empty, where fewer and fewer people express a belief in God, and fewer still understand the morals and values that they base their lives upon, things like Band-Aid, showy acts of public charitability towards people one secretly perceives as lesser beings than themselves, are a way to temporarily fill that emptiness and distract from the dissonance created by a lifestyle and value system that connect little with reality. Few other Christmas songs arguably have ever had the impact that the Band-Aid song has had. Few others have ever summed up a zeitgeist, let alone one as rotten as our modern age, like this one song. The folly of our foreign policy, our naivety about those outside the West, our obsession with vacuous celebrities, and the sheer superficiality of our conception of what is good are all embodied by this one song. Thankfully, we've heard the end of it, for at least another year.